Well, let's begin today by diving in and reading the entirety of Revelation chapter 12, and then we'll go back and look at the three major sections of the chapter, and we'll also look at some other things as we prepare to get into those sections. So, Revelation chapter 12, beginning with verse 1, if you would. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short." When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. Now, once again, John takes us back in time and is preparing to fill in more information. And he is also giving us a movie trailer version again of what he's preparing to show us, like he did in chapter 6. So as we look at chapter 12, remember that this is the condensed version of what's coming up. But remember, it is still covering the same period of time as all of the previous chapters from a different perspective, the time of the end. This time, he is going to take us back to events leading up to the beginning of the time of the end, and then into the time of the end once again. We know who the dragon is because the passage tells us. It's Satan. He's identified. But we still need to answer a couple of questions so that we can understand what John is showing us. And those questions are, if you would, who is the woman and who is the child? We know that the woman cannot be the New Testament church in that in Revelation 12:5 we read, "She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne." And we know that this reference to a male child is a reference to, if you would, Christ. And the church did not bring Christ into the world. Also, once again, we have a reference back to, if you would, Psalm chapter 2. "You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth." And this is a prophecy concerning Christ. We're aware of that. But then we read in Revelation 12:17, if you would. "Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus." Of course, in this context, the offspring would not be Christ, but would be, if you would, Christians. So, we have both a reference to the singular, to the Messiah, and in the plural to the Christians, or the church, and both are connected to the woman. And we began with the child being a direct reference to Christ, and the latter references being to Christians. So, the woman cannot only be the Old Testament faithful Jews, both ethnic and Gentile proselytes, through whom the Messiah was brought into the world, because we have a reference to the church as being her offspring as well. Nor can the woman only be the New Testament church, because the church did not bring the Messiah into the world. And the rest of her offspring referred to in verse 17 would be those that the church brought to Christ. And then we also have the connection to the 1,260 days and the times, and half times again. It all connects us back to the two olive trees that we've talked about before. So, who is the woman? Understanding that context and those connections, if you would. The woman represents the faithful servants of God throughout all of the ages, just as the two olive trees did, just as the lampstands did. The faithful servants of God brought the Messiah into the world, and the resulting faithful servants of God are bringing others to Christ. That is the overall picture of what we have, and begins with the male child, and then we have the rest of her offspring. So therefore, the male child and the offspring referred to later are all offspring of the faithful servants of God throughout the ages. The true Israel of God, Paul refers to in Galatians. And what would be the meaning of the woman being clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and the crown of stars? Again, let's look at the Old Testament imagery, if you would. Isaiah 60. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and His glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. And then we have Zechariah 9, if you would. The Lord their God will save His people on that day as a shepherd saves his flock. They will sparkle in His land like jewels in a crown. A key phrase is found in the Isaiah passage where Isaiah writes, "But the Lord rises upon you, and His glory appears over you." The idea of His glory appearing over His people is the same as saying His glory covers His people. And so, if you would, the sun, moon, and stars are imagery of God's glory reflected through the faithful, and also shows God's favor upon the faithful as He covers them in His glory. They are also symbolic of the faithful being called the chosen or elect. The faithful servants of God, the Israel of God, are given honor and glory and protection. Not because of anything we have done, but because of what Christ has done. And we are called to reflect God's glory to the world around us. We're called to reflect Christ. And so we see that in that imagery of the woman being clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and the crown of stars on her head. Now, let's see what John is showing us. Let's go back to the first 6 verses, if you would. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to His throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. What we have in these first 6 verses is the culmination of everything that God was doing through His faithful servants throughout the Old Testament. That of, if you would, bringing the Messiah into the world to give His life to redeem the faithful of the past, present, and future. As the Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews chapter 10, if you would, first he said, sacrifice and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, though they were offered in accordance with the law. Then he said, here I am, I have come to do your will. He sets aside the first to establish the second, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And so we have that is a culmination of things leading up to everything that God was doing. And we have the dragon, which is later identified as Satan, waiting and preparing to destroy or kill the Messiah the moment he is born. And we know that he tried to accomplish this through Herod when Jesus was born. And the picture of this dragon's tail sweeping a third of the stars from the sky is imagery of his causing many angels in heaven to rebel along with him. And so these opening verses are a picture of the conflict in that spiritual realm when Christ was born and they fled to Egypt. Then being snatched up to God and to his throne is a picture of the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Christ. Since he wasn't able to get the Messiah killed by Herod, if you would, Satan believed that turning the people against the Messiah and having him crucified would put an end to God's plan. What he did not know is that the Messiah being crucified was a part of the plan, and that Jesus allowed himself to be crucified. Satan didn't accomplish it. Christ allowed it to happen because it was the plan. And Christ was the willing sacrifice for our sin. The picture of the woman fleeing into the wilderness is a picture of the faithful servants of God going into hiding or underground. It is also a picture of God always having a remnant of faithful servants, even when the faithful are being persecuted. We tend to think of the faithful being persecuted as something that happened in the New Testament, don't we? As we look at what took place, especially throughout Acts, and we know historically, the persecution under Rome and things like that. But it also happened under the Old Testament as well. The faithful of the Old Testament also found themselves going into hiding at times. And many times they were driven into hiding because of persecution from the unfaithful within their own Jewish community. Such as when Jezebel led the Israelites to worship Baal, and the prophets of God had to go into hiding. And then we have the 1,260 days, just as we did with the two witnesses, which further connects the woman to being the faithful servants of God throughout time that we've already looked at in that context. So, if you would, once again, it confirms that the true faithful will not always remain in hiding. The 1,260 days still represents a finite period of time, just as we've looked at before. That everything that is going on will come to an end. So Satan thinks he's won when Christ died on the cross and was buried. But then we pick up in Revelation 12:7. If you would. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. These verses are a picture of the war that took place in the spiritual realm when Christ was raised from the dead. When Jesus was raised from the dead, he conquered the power of Satan through his shed blood. Satan would no longer be able to accuse the faithful servants of God, both those of the old who were longing for the Messiah to come, and all of those who would come to know Christ through the preaching of the gospel, because now, if you would, they are covered by the blood of the Lamb. They are forgiven. They are redeemed and adopted into the family of God. And so it is that the Apostle Paul boldly writes in Romans chapter 8, if you would, "What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us." The accuser, the one who stood before God condemning his people, was cast out permanently. And Satan had been continually accusing the faithful up until that point. But Christ put an end to that with his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, which resulted in the war that drove Satan out. The Scriptures tell us that the coming of the Messiah was longed for. We see it in the prophecies, such as, if you would, Numbers chapter 24. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will arise out of Israel. He will crush the forehead of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city." Jesus told his disciples in Matthew chapter 13, if you would, "But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it." The Apostle Paul writes in 2 Timothy, if you would, "Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." And so the events that we see taking place in Revelation 12 have been longed for, have been looked forward to. And when Jesus came, was crucified, buried, and rose again, if you would, Satan was permanently driven from heaven along with all of the angels that had rebelled with him. This was the greatest victory in all of history. Jesus declared shortly before his death in John 12, if you would, "Now is the time for judgment on this world, and now the prince of this world will be driven out. And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." And so as we're looking at what's taking place through here, three monumental things have happened in this short passage. If you would, the accuser, Satan, has been permanently cast out of heaven and cast down to earth. Salvation has come through the shed blood of Christ, and the kingdom, the church, has been established. Just as John declared in Revelation 1:9, if you would, "I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus." You see, the kingdom isn't something we are waiting for and looking for. Rather, if you would, the kingdom is here now, and all of God's faithful servants are a part of that kingdom. And once we understand that, it is very important, and it is important that we do understand that. But as we understand it, we begin to understand it is inappropriate for us to pray, "Thy kingdom come." For such a prayer rejects the establishment of the church. So when someone suggests praying the Lord's Prayer, don't. First of all, it is a model prayer and not the Lord's Prayer. And some of the elements of that model prayer were only applicable at the time prior to Pentecost. Like we already established, if you would, we are not waiting for his kingdom to come. It is already here. And that is absolutely crucial to being able to understand many things in Revelation, especially things that we will be talking about later, such as the 1,000 years of chapter 20. So Satan has been cast down, salvation has come, and the kingdom has been established. Scriptures tell us Satan knows he cannot win. And we have the proclamation that we find in chapter 12, verse 12, if you would. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. See, there's no longer a war going on in heaven. And so those who have gone before us rejoice in that they are at peace. When the faithful servants of God die and have been faithful unto death, if you would, the war is over for them. We like the Revelation 21 passage that talks about no more pain, no more sickness and death, crying, and so on. But if you would, there is also no more temptation, no more hate, and no more battling Satan in our lives. But for those who are still alive on the earth, if you would, the war is still on. As Satan seeks to cause as much damage as he can before the final judgment. So let's pick up with verse 13, if you would. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Okay. Satan has been permanently cast out of heaven. So he turns his fury towards the faithful servants of God and drives the church underground. There are many who try to assign this as being one specific period in history, specifically the Middle Ages, when the Roman Catholic Church became the government of Europe and used the Bible as a weapon. Only the elite were permitted to have an education. Only the clergy were permitted to read the Bible. Traditions of men took precedent over what the Word said. And translations of the Bible into the common language of the man, whether English or any other language, were forbidden. And anyone who disagreed with anything the church said or did was labeled a heretic and executed, usually by being burned at the stake. And those who held to what the Bible actually says went into hiding. This control even reached to the New World for a time. But then in the late 1700s, the Catholic Church's control was thrown off and independent churches began to spring up who looked to the Bible as their only source of spiritual guidance. And the Restoration movement, which the Christian churches and churches of Christ are part of, began. And many claim that this fits comfortably into the time frame given for the church to come out of the wilderness. But what about the church in China, North Korea, and the Muslim-controlled Middle East today? Do we deny that the same thing is happening there because someone has conveniently fit this period into the Middle Ages of the Bible? No. Once again, we have to understand that the Bible is not a puzzle book. While the period of the Catholic Church's dominance over Europe may seem to fit the description, we need to understand that the prophecy is not limited to that period of time. The 1,260 days and times and half times and 42 months are all telling us that a time will come when the war will end and Satan will be cast into the lake of fire and the faithful servants of God will be at peace for all eternity. They're telling us that these things have a finite existence. They are going to come to an end. So rather, we see in the text the understanding that this is something that will continue to happen repeatedly until Christ returns. Yes, during the Middle Ages, the true church went underground. Today, the church has gone underground in China. The church has gone underground in North Korea. The church has gone underground in other nations, especially those controlled by Islam. And at some point, it will come to an end. And let's take a closer look at what is actually said. in verses 13 through 16. If you would. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of an eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. From his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And so the dragon pursues the woman, the faithful of God, and she's carried into the wilderness. In other words, like we said before, if you would, the church goes into hiding. The spewing water like a river would be the various ways that Satan tries to destroy the church in this imagery, such as, if you would, through various wars in the places where the church is in hiding, or by flooding the church with false doctrines. Of course, we've already looked at the fact that that was already taking place in the church at that time, when we looked at the sections in chapters 2 and 3. But the text also shows us that even though the church is driven into hiding, Satan is not able to destroy it. And so then we read in chapter 12, verse 17, if you would, then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So who would be the rest of her offspring if she's in hiding? What's he talking about? In writing about the martyrdom of Stephen, Luke writes, if you would, in Acts 8:1, and Saul approved of their killing him. On that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. The church was driven underground in Jerusalem, and as a result, many fled. And when they fled, what happened? Well, Acts 8:4, if you would. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Do you see what's being described in Revelation 12 here? This is not one specific period of time within the time of the end. It represents what is continually going on throughout the time of the end. Satan drives the church into hiding. Many of the faithful are scattered and flee to a place where they're not persecuted. They begin to bring people to Christ where they fled to. And Satan follows them and tries to stop the spread of the gospel, but only manages to once again drive the church into hiding in that place. And once again, many are scattered, and the process takes place all over. And meanwhile, the church eventually comes out of hiding in places where it has been in hiding. So the picture John is giving us is Satan drives the church into hiding and still does his best to destroy it, even then, but cannot destroy the true church. Then he goes after those who have scattered and follows them wherever they go and tries to stop the gospel from being spread. But in the process, only continues to drive the church temporarily underground. But there are always those who flee, and the gospel continues to spread everywhere they go. And everywhere the church has been driven into hiding, the gospel is spread, and the church eventually comes out of hiding. And when it does, it is usually stronger and more resilient than it was before it went into hiding. And through it all, if you would, Satan cannot prevail and wipe out the church. He pursues the faithful no matter where they flee, but he cannot stop the church. As Jesus promised in Matthew 16, if you would, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. In our day and age, we see this passage happening throughout the world. We also continue to see Jesus' promise kept that, if you would, his church will stand no matter what. As we look at the persecuted brothers and sisters throughout the world, we see this being fulfilled over and over again, that no matter how hard Satan uses whatever forces are available to him to try and stamp out the church, it still remains. Everything we've talked about today is key to what we'll be looking at in the next 2 chapters of Revelation. And as we go through Revelation, we will keep seeing that no matter what happens, if you would, the true church always remains. Feel like things are getting tough? Sometimes you feel like you're backed into a corner. Sometimes you begin to wonder if it's worth it. We see the promise over and over being fulfilled. The church will remain, and it will be worth it. And so one of the great challenges that comes out of Revelation is no matter what you face in this life, understand that the church will remain, and whatever you have to go through, it will be worth the endurance when Christ returns. As we prepare to close, I would encourage you to strive to be one of those who is constantly spreading the gospel, who is reaching out to those in the community around us. I know sometimes it can be intimidating because a lot of people, they believe they're Christians simply because they believe in God and whatever. But they need to know the truth. They need to know what the Scriptures say about becoming one of the sealed, so that they too can stand on that final day. They need to understand it's through Jesus Christ and His shed blood only that we have access. And there is only one way to be in a right relationship with Him. And so I would encourage you, be one of those who holds fast to the testimony, who proclaims the word, regardless of what may be going on in your life. Because it will be worth it.